All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a closer look at Sun Pharma Advanced Research Company Limited.
Spark?
Spark, exactly. You probably know them better as Spark.
Yep.
They just released their Q2 FY25 results, and we've got some pretty cool stuff to look at today.
Yeah, we do.
We've got the official press release straight from Spark.
Right.
And we've got their letter
Yeah.
to the National Stock Exchange of India.
The NSE.
The NSE, there you go. No secondhand summaries here. We are going straight to the source.
That's right. And that's really important because it lets us cut through a lot of the noise and get right to the heart of what the company is actually saying.
That's what we like to do here on the deep dive, get to the heart of it.
Absolutely.
Now, just a quick reminder, Spark is a subsidiary of Sun Pharma.
A pharmaceutical giant.
The pharmaceutical giant, that's right. And they kind of specialize in this, I don't want to get too technical here, but they specialize in specialty generics, which is kind of the trickier end of generic drug development.
Yeah, it's not your typical copycat kind of generic drug development. There's a lot more complexity involved.
A lot more complexity. So that's where Spark comes in. But enough background. Let's get into the financials. One thing that really jumped out at me, and I think you noticed this too, was the length of the board of directors meeting to approve these results.
I did.
Over 3 hours.
3 hours. That's a long time for a board meeting, especially for quarterly results. You know, typically these things are much shorter.
Much shorter, yeah.
So it suggests that there were some pretty in-depth discussions happening.
Yeah, what could they have been talking about for so long?
Well, it's tough to say for sure, but it could be anything from unexpected challenges this quarter to a major strategic decision they're considering. Yeah. Maybe a new acquisition, a divestiture, something big.
Ooh, juicy. All right, before we go full conspiracy theorist on this, let's back up a bit. We're also seeing this limited review report mentioned in the letter to the National Stock Exchange. What exactly is that, and why should investors even care?
So a limited review report is basically like a mini audit.
Okay.
It's done by an independent auditor,
Right.
and it's not a full-blown audit of all the financials.
Okay.
But it's a check to make sure that the numbers are presented fairly and that they're in line with accounting standards.
So it's like a little bit of a check.
It's a check, yeah.
To make sure that everything looks kosher?
Exactly. It gives investors a bit more confidence in the numbers, especially when you're dealing with complex financial information, like we are here.
Makes sense. Okay. So it's like a mini audit to make sure everything looks on the up and up. Got it. Now let's get to the heart of the matter. Revenue. Did Spark see growth this quarter, or did things take a dip?
Well, that's where things get a little interesting. If you look closely at both the press release and the letter to the NSE, you'll notice that they don't actually give a specific revenue figure for the quarter.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is, not entirely uncommon, but it does leave us wanting a little bit more.
Okay, so a little bit of a cliffhanger on the revenue front. What about profits? Any major factors at play there this quarter, or is that also under wraps?
Well, again, without the revenue figure, it's tough to give a definitive answer on profits.
Yeah.
But one thing that we always have to consider with a company like Spark is their research and development spending.
Right, R&D.
R&D, exactly. Because they're so focused on these complex drug developments that requires a lot of investment.
Yeah, that's a great point. For companies like Spark, R&D is kind of their lifeblood.
Yeah, it's the engine for their future growth.
Right, but it can also be a bit of a drag in the short term, right?
It can definitely impact short-term profitability.
Okay, so we know that R&D spending is likely a factor here. Do we have any insights into what Spark is actually working on right now in terms of their R&D projects, or is that top secret?
Well, they don't go into specifics about individual projects.
Right.
But they do emphasize their commitment to developing what they call their pipeline of specialty generics.
Okay.
So it's safe to assume that they're actively pursuing new opportunities in this space.
So lots of potential for future growth, but maybe some short-term pressure on those profit numbers.
Potentially, yeah.
Okay, got it. Now let's shift gears and talk about expectations. How did Spark's performance this quarter stack up against what analysts were predicting? Did they meet expectations, beat them, miss them, and maybe even more importantly, how did the market react?
Well, this is where that lack of specific revenue and profit numbers really comes back to bite us. Because without those figures, it's virtually impossible to make a direct comparison to what analysts were forecasting.
Right.
We'll have to wait and see if the company provides more specific guidance in the future.
Or if those analysts kind of adjust their their projections,
Right,
just
exactly.
on what little information we do have.
Exactly.
Okay, so some unanswered questions there, but that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right?
Absolutely, it's a bit of a mystery.
We're playing financial detective today,
Love it.
piecing together the puzzle.
Hmm.
Speaking of clues, was there anything in the letter to the National Stock Exchange that really stood out to you? Any hints about future plans or potential challenges that might be lurking on the horizon?
Well, putting aside the 3-hour board meeting, which we've already thoroughly discussed,
Of course,
one
yes.
thing that did catch my eye was their discussion of the evolving regulatory landscape
Okay.
in some of their key markets.
Right.
They specifically mentioned navigating complex regulatory pathways in their letter.
So, I mean, the pharmaceutical industry is heavily
It
regulated.
is.
So it's not surprising that they're facing some regulatory hurdles.
Right. But the fact that they're explicitly calling it out suggests that this might be a significant factor to watch moving forward.
So regulatory approvals could be a make or break factor for pharmaceutical companies, especially when they're trying to launch new products.
Absolutely. It can really impact their timeline
Yeah.
for bringing new drugs to market,
Right.
which then, of course, affects their revenue and profitability.
Okay, so we've got some potential hints about future challenges, but also lots of potential for future growth, especially with their focus on these specialty generics. Now let's zoom out a bit. How does Spark's performance this quarter, even with the limited information that we have, fit into the broader trends we've been seeing in the pharmaceutical industry?
That's a great question. The pharmaceutical industry as a whole is facing a number of headwinds right now. You've got rising costs,
Hmm.
increased competition, and of course, that ever-evolving regulatory landscape that we just talked about.
It sounds like Spark isn't immune to those industry-wide challenges. But on the flip side, what about opportunities? Are there any tailwinds that Spark might be particularly well positioned to capitalize on?
Well, one major opportunity for companies like Spark is the growing demand for generic drugs
Okay.
globally. As patents on those big blockbuster drugs expire,
Right.
there's a huge market opening up for generics.
Yeah.
And companies that can develop those complex generics like Spark have a real competitive advantage.
So it sounds like Spark is playing in a field with both challenges and opportunities. Pretty typical for any company in a dynamic industry,
Rest
right?
much, yeah. Yeah.
But what sets Spark apart from the competition? What's their secret sauce?
Well, I think one of their key differentiators is, again, that focus on specialty generics.
Hmm.
These are typically more complex to develop than traditional generics,
Right.
but they also command higher prices and face less competition.
So they're focusing on a niche market where they can potentially carve out a really strong position for themselves. Now, let's bring this back to the investor perspective. What should investors be watching closely moving forward with Spark? What are the key things to keep an eye on?
Well, I think one key thing is their progress in developing that pipeline of specialty generics.
Okay.
Are they getting those regulatory approvals?
Hmm.
Are they actually launching new products?
Right.
Those are all positive indicators of future growth.
Yeah. Investors always like to see companies with a strong pipeline, right?
Absolutely.
So that's definitely something to watch. Anything else investors should be keeping on their radar?
Well, closely related to that is their ability to navigate that changing regulatory landscape.
Right.
Can they get those approvals in those key markets?
Hmm.
Can they stay ahead of the curve when it comes to new regulations?
Yeah.
That's going to be really crucial for their long-term success.
So regulatory hurdles are a potential risk, but their focus on specialty generics could be a significant advantage. Okay, let's take a quick pause here and just kind of recap what we've uncovered so far. We've dived into Spark's Q2 FY25 results.
Yep.
And while we're missing some key financial figures, we've definitely gleaned some interesting insights.
We have.
We discussed the unusual length of that board meeting,
Right.
the importance of that limited review report, and the potential impact of R&D spending on their profitability.
All important factors.
Yeah, absolutely. We've also explored the challenges and opportunities facing Spark, from the evolving regulatory landscape to the growing demand for generic drugs, and specifically their strategic focus on specialty generics.
Well, lots to unpack.
A lot to unpack. Now, I am still very curious about that 3-hour board meeting.
I know, it's hard to let go of.
It is.
It's not every day that you see a board huddled together for that long, especially for a quarterly results meeting.
Right. What do you think was going on behind those closed doors?
Well, your guess is as good as mine at this point.
Were they debating a potential acquisition? grappling with a major regulatory setback. Or maybe they were just enjoying an epic catered lunch.
Maybe all of the above.
Maybe. We can only speculate.
We can.
But I have a feeling more details will emerge in time.
Hopefully.
All right, we'll have to keep our detective hats on for this one. Stay tuned, because in part 2 of our deep dive, we'll continue to explore Spark's Q2 performance, searching for those missing pieces of the puzzle.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Spark's Q2 FY25 performance. Before we took a little break there, we were discussing that extended board meeting.
Right.
And speculating about what might have been on the agenda.
Yeah, that 3-hour meeting is still just kind of lingering in my mind.
It's a big question mark.
It is. It's a question mark hanging over these results.
While we can't know for sure what they discussed, we can look at Spark's recent activities and industry trends to make some educated guesses.
Okay, I like where this is going. Let's put on our analyst hats and start connecting the dots.
All right, so one possibility is that they were discussing a potential acquisition or merger.
Okay.
Consolidation is a major trend in the pharmaceutical industry these days.
It is.
And Spark could be looking to expand its portfolio or reach a wider market through a strategic partnership.
That's a great point. Acquisitions can be, real game changers, right?
Absolutely.
For pharmaceutical companies.
Yeah, it gives them access to new technologies, new markets, new talent.
Absolutely.
All sorts of possibilities.
All right, so acquisitions, that's definitely on the table. What else? What other possibilities are we thinking about?
Well, another possibility is that they were addressing regulatory challenges.
Okay.
As we mentioned earlier, navigating the regulatory landscape is crucial for any pharmaceutical company.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially one like Spark. And remember, they specifically mentioned complex regulatory pathways in their letter to the National Stock Exchange.
Yeah, so maybe they hit a snag with a regulatory approval or ran into some unexpected hurdles along the way.
It's certainly plausible.
It would explain the extended meeting time.
It would, because regulatory setbacks can be costly.
Yeah.
And time-consuming. And the board may have been trying to figure out how to overcome those obstacles.
Okay, so we've got acquisitions and regulatory challenges as potential explanations for the board meeting. Anything else we should be considering?
Well, don't forget that Spark is a subsidiary of Sun Pharma.
Right, the pharmaceutical giant.
Exactly, a much larger company. So it's possible that the extended board meeting involves discussions about Spark's role within the larger Sun Pharma group.
Interesting. So maybe they were talking about strategic alignment.
Could be.
Resource allocation, or even potential changes to Spark's structure within the parent company.
Exactly. We have to remember that Spark's performance isn't happening in isolation. It's influenced by the decisions and strategies of Sun Pharma as well.
Okay, so a lot of potential factors at play here. We've got a few solid theories about that mysterious board meeting.
We do.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about Spark's competitive landscape. Who are they up against?
Yep.
Who are their main rivals? How do they stack up against the competition?
So Spark operates in the specialty generics market, which is, it's a specific niche within the broader pharmaceutical industry.
Right, right.
Some of their main competitors in this space include companies like Teva, Pharmaceutical Industries, Mylan, and Sandoz.
And how does Spark, differentiate itself from these big players? What are their strengths and weaknesses?
Well, one of their key strengths, as we've discussed, is their focus on those complex generics.
Right.
Those are typically more challenging to develop, but they also command higher prices.
Right.
And often face less competition.
So they're kind of targeting a niche within a niche.
They are.
Where they can really potentially dominate.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. What about weaknesses? Are there any areas where they might be, a little vulnerable?
One potential weakness is that they rely on a relatively small number of products.
Okay.
They've had a lot of success with certain specialty generics.
Right.
But their portfolio isn't as diverse as some of their larger competitors.
So if one of their key products faces increased competition or some, challenging regulatory hurdles,
right,
it could have a real impact on their bottom line.
Exactly. It could have a ripple effect.
Okay, and then I imagine their dependence on regulatory approvals is a potential weakness as well.
Absolutely. As we've discussed, navigating the regulatory landscape is crucial for any pharmaceutical company.
It is.
And Spark is no exception.
Right, so those regulatory hurdles could really slow down their growth or even completely derail their plans for new product launches.
That's a high-stakes game.
It is. It's a high-stakes game. Okay, so we have a pretty good understanding of Spark's competitive landscape.
I think so.
Their strengths, their weaknesses, and the key players that they're up against. Now, let's bring this back to the Q2 results. We've talked a lot about those missing financial figures,
Oh, we have.
but what can we glean from the information we do have?
Well, I think one key takeaway is Spark's continued emphasis on research and development.
Okay.
Even though we don't have specific figures,
Right.
the press release and the letter to the National Stock Exchange really highlight their ongoing investment in developing these new specialty generics.
So they're playing the long game here.
They are.
Even if there are some potential short-term costs.
It seems that way.
They're really focused on building that pipeline for future growth.
Absolutely. That's a good sign for long-term investors.
It is, yeah. And they're also clearly committed to navigating that evolving regulatory landscape.
Absolutely.
Right. They specifically mention those complex regulatory pathways in their letter, so.
It's top of mind for them. They're aware of the challenges, and they're working to overcome them.
So they're not just sitting back and hoping for the best. They're being proactive.
Exactly.
Okay, so despite the lack of specific financial figures, we're starting to get a sense of Spark's priorities and their approach to navigating those challenges and the opportunities in the pharmaceutical industry.
Absolutely.
Now let's zoom out even further and talk about the broader macroeconomic environment. How are global economic trends impacting the pharmaceutical industry as a whole, and how is Spark positioned to weather the storm?
Well, it's no secret that the global economy is facing a number of headwinds right now.
It is not, no.
Inflation, rising interest rates, geopolitical uncertainty.
Right, all fun stuff.
Yeah. It's a mixed bag out there.
And those macroeconomic factors, I mean, they're definitely impacting the pharmaceutical industry, right?
Absolutely. Rising inflation is pushing up the costs of raw materials. And manufacturing and rising interest rates are making it more expensive for companies to borrow money and invest in new projects.
So it's a tough environment for any company right now.
It is.
But especially, those that are in research-intensive industries.
Right, exactly.
Like pharmaceuticals.
So how is Spark navigating these challenges?
Well, one advantage that they have and other pharmaceutical companies have is that they're selling essential products.
Right.
People need medicine, whether the economy is booming or busting.
People got to have their meds.
They do. So even in a recession, the demand for pharmaceuticals is likely to remain relatively stable.
So that's good for Spark.
That's good news.
But they're not totally immune to those broader economic pressures.
Not at all.
Right. I mean, they still need to manage their costs effectively and make smart decisions.
Absolutely.
To make sure that they're viable over the long term.
It's a balancing act.
It is. They need to invest in R&D to drive future growth, but they also need to control costs to maintain profitability in the short term.
So they're walking a tightrope here.
They are.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
From that mysterious board meeting to the competitive landscape to the broader macroeconomic environment.
It's a big picture view.
Before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, Spark's focus on those complex generics. Can you elaborate on that a bit more? What makes those generics so complex, and why is Spark choosing to specialize in this area?
Okay, so think of it this way.
All right.
A traditional generic drug is like baking a cake from a well-established recipe.
Right.
You've got all the ingredients, the instructions,
Easy peasy.
straightforward. A complex generic
Okay.
is more like trying to recreate a gourmet dish,
All right.
just based on taste alone.
Oh.
You have a general idea of the ingredients, but the exact proportions, the cooking techniques, even sourcing certain ingredients, that can get really tricky.
So it requires a much deeper understanding of the underlying science.
Absolutely.
The manufacturing processes.
Yeah, you're not just copying a recipe anymore.
Right, you're kind of reverse engineering it.
Exactly.
So complex generics, I mean, they often involve, formulations that are harder to manufacture, unique delivery systems, and they require really specialized testing, right?
They do.
To make sure that they're actually bioequivalent to the original brand name drug.
A much higher bar.
And why is Spark, choosing to specialize in this area? Is it just about the higher profit margins?
Well, higher profit margins are certainly a factor,
Okay.
but I think it's more than that.
Right.
They're really carving out a niche for themselves
Yeah.
in a very crowded market.
Right.
They're focusing on areas where there's less competition
Okay.
and a higher barrier to entry.
So it's strategic.
It is.
It's not just about the money. It's about, really establishing themselves.
Positioning themselves for the long term.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the challenges that Sparks faces,
Right.
regulatory hurdles, macroeconomic environment, all that fun stuff.
Yeah.
What about opportunities?
Okay.
What are some of the tailwinds that could really kind of propel their growth in the coming years?
Well, one significant opportunity is the growing global demand for generic drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Healthcare costs are rising all over the world,
They are.
and governments and insurers are increasingly looking to generics as a way to cut those costs.
Yeah.
This trend is particularly pronounced in emerging markets,
Yeah.
where access to affordable healthcare is a major concern.
A huge concern, yeah.
So Spark is really well positioned
Right.
to capitalize on this global shift towards generics.
Okay, so that's a big one.
It is.
What else? What other opportunities are out there?
Another opportunity stems from the increasing complexity of new drug development.
Okay.
Brand name pharmaceutical companies are focusing on these incredibly specialized and complex drugs.
Right.
And that creates a larger pool of potential targets for complex generics.
So in a way,
Yeah.
the innovation that's happening at the brand name level is creating opportunities for companies like Spark.
Exactly. It's like a ripple effect.
All right, now let's bring this back to the investors. If someone's listening to this and they're thinking about investing in Spark, what are some of the key things they should be looking at? What are the metrics that really matter?
Okay, so beyond the obvious things like revenue and profit growth,
The basics.
fundamentals, yeah.
What else should they be paying attention to?
One really key metric is Spark's R&D pipeline.
Okay, yeah.
Are they continuing to invest in those new products? Investors should be tracking the progress of their clinical trials, their regulatory submissions, potential product launches. A strong R&D pipeline is really a good indicator of future growth.
So, are they continuing to innovate? Are they developing those new products?
Exactly.
Okay, so that's a big one. What else?
Another important metric is their regulatory success rate.
Okay.
How good are they at actually getting those approvals
Right.
for their complex generics?
Yeah. It's one thing to have a pipeline full of promising products, but if you can't get them approved,
Right.
it doesn't really matter.
Exactly. A high success rate shows that they understand the regulatory landscape and that they have a good track record.
Okay, so regulatory success rate, that's a big one. Anything else investors should be keeping in mind?
I think it's always a good idea to look at a company's financial health.
Right. The fundamentals.
The fundamentals, yeah.
Yeah.
Do they have a strong balance sheet? Are they managing their debt well?
These are important things for any company,
Absolutely.
but especially for companies in a research-intensive industry.
Right, exactly.
Or pharmaceuticals.
They need that solid financial foundation
Yeah.
to be able to invest in that R&D
Right.
to weather those economic storms
Yeah.
and to seize those growth opportunities.
Okay, so strong financials are key.
Very important.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We explored, Spark's Q2 FY25 results, delved into the complexities of their business.
Yeah.
We analyzed their competitive landscape.
Yep.
We even considered the broader macroeconomic factors that are at play here.
It's a holistic view.
Before we wrap up, I want to circle back to that limited review report we discussed earlier. Does that report offer any clues about Spark's future prospects?
Okay.
Or is it purely focused on the past?
Well, a limited review report is primarily focused on the historical accuracy of the financial statements.
Okay.
But it can actually provide some subtle hints about the future.
Right.
Because auditors often consider a company's plans and prospects when they're evaluating their financial position.
So it's kind of like reading between the lines.
It is.
Looking for any clues that the auditors might be dropping about Spark's trajectory.
Exactly.
All right. So, for example, if the auditors express concerns about Spark's ability to get future funding,
Right.
or they highlighted risks related to their dependence on a few key products, those would be red flags for investors.
Big red flags.
Yeah.
So even though the report isn't making any explicit predictions about the future,
Right.
a careful reading can provide some really valuable context and maybe some early warning signs.
Okay, so we need to
Put on our detective hats.
put on those detective hats
Yeah.
and scrutinize that limited review report.
Exactly.
But even without a crystal ball, we can still make some educated guesses about what the future might hold for Spark.
You can. I mean, knowing what we know about their focus on those specialty generics and the overall competitive landscape, it's reasonable to expect continued investment in research and development.
Right.
They'll likely be looking for opportunities to expand that product portfolio and target new markets.
And we can't rule out strategic partnerships.
Of course not.
Or even acquisitions.
Absolutely.
Those moves can really shake things up in the pharmaceutical world.
They're game changers.
Yeah.
So while we don't have all the answers today, I think we've built a pretty solid foundation for understanding Spark's current position and where they might be headed in the future.
The key is to stay informed, watch for updates, and be ready to adapt as new information comes out.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, it's like we've given our listeners a map and a compass.
A good analogy.
To navigate this this exciting.
It is exciting.
And sometimes unpredictable world of pharmaceutical investing.
And who knows, maybe by our next deep dive, we'll have those missing financial figures.
I hope so.
And we can paint a much clearer picture.
Fingers crossed.
Of Spark's Q2 performance.
Huh.
But until then,
yes,
keep those investor hats on.
And those minds curious.
Always be learning.
Always be learning. All right, that's it for the deep dive. Thanks for joining us.